April 1919. A British battleship rides at anchor off the coast of Crimea. Up the gangway comes an old woman in black, 71 years old, one of the most famous women alive, and nearly everything she still owns fits inside a single locked box. She refuses to sail until every refugee on that shoreline has a berth, so the battleship waits 4 days. The people who leave with her scatter into 3 destinies. One of them will die in a borrowed room above a beauty parlor in Toronto. One will live out her days on the charity of the King of England, and one of their cousins will soon crown himself emperor of a country that no longer exists. Because this, on paper, was the richest family human history had ever produced. They ruled 1/6 of the land on Earth, palaces by the dozen, a fleet of yachts, eggs of gold and enamel that now change hands for tens of millions of dollars. The figure most often cited values the head of this family at $300 billion in today's money, and then over a handful of nights between 1918 and 1919, the heart of that family was erased, shot in basements, thrown down a mineshaft, and executed in a fortress. You may know that story. This video is about the other one, the dozens who got out. Their story turns on 2 questions. First, did even $1 of the greatest fortune on Earth make it into exile with them? Second, who carries the name today, and why are they still at war over a throne that has not existed for a century? By the end, you will have both answers, and neither is what you expect. Stay with me, the truth is stranger than the legend. The family was the Romanovs. The dynasty had ruled Russia for 304 years. And the woman on the battleship was Maria Feodorovna, the Dowager Empress, mother of Nicholas II, the last tsar. The ship was His Majesty's ship Marlborough, sent by her nephew King George V of England to pull her out of the wreckage of the Russian Revolution. By most accounts, 17 members of the imperial family climbed aboard with her at Yalta. Grand dukes, princesses, children, bound for Malta and a lifetime of exile. Survivors described one moment above all. As the Marlborough weighed anchor, a shipload of white Russian soldiers passed close by, heading the other way, toward the front. They recognized the small figure at the rail, and they sang her the imperial anthem, the last time she would ever hear it. She was one of the lucky ones, and she knew it. In the 2 years before, the Bolsheviks had killed roughly 18 members of the dynasty, the Tsar, his wife, all 5 of their children, his brother, and a chain of grand dukes and princes across Siberia and Petrograd. But here is the number that surprises people. Most of the family survived. Of the Romanovs alive at the revolution, at least 35 were still living in 1920. By some counts, closer to 45. They came out through Crimea, through Finland, through the Caucasus, by battleship, by sledge, by forged papers. And the Dowager Empress came out with the box. Inside it, the jewels of a Russian empress, ropes of pearls, sapphires the size of thumbnails, diamonds gathered across half a century at the richest court in Europe. In exile in Denmark, she reportedly kept that box under her bed and refused to sell a single stone. Remember the box. Everything in this story comes back to it. But here is the first twist. That $300 billion, the number attached to this family in every headline, was never money they could spend. It counted the crown lands, the gold reserve, the palaces, the mines and railways of an empire. The Tsar controlled it the way a captain controls a ship. Absolutely, and not at all. It could not be packed, wired abroad, or hidden. So when the state fell, the fortune fell with it, because the fortune was the state. What about actual cash abroad? For decades, rumor insisted there were 600 million gold rubles waiting in the Bank of England. Researchers who finally traced the accounts found something closer to a tragedy of good intentions. His father before him had banked some 90 million gold rubles in London, and Nicholas brought nearly all of it home to Russia. What remained abroad during the war was reportedly poured into hospitals and relief. A last fund for the children, moved to Berlin, was devoured by German hyperinflation until it was worth almost nothing. By 1917, the personal accounts of the richest man on Earth held about 1 million rubles. Read that again. 1 million out of 300 billion. The survivors stepped ashore in Malta, in Paris, in Copenhagen, carrying jewelry, medals, manners, and almost nothing else. Hold on to that detail because it explains everything that happens next. It explains, for instance, the taxes. Some 200,000 Russian exiles washed into France, and Paris in the 1920s filled with fallen nobility doing whatever paid. The legend says Grand Dukes drove cabs. The record is only slightly less cinematic. The Union of Russian Taxi Drivers in Paris counted around 5,000 members, and among the men at the wheel were princes, counts, colonels of the Imperial Guard, and at least one genuine princess, Sofia Dolgorukova, whose ancestry by most accounts ran back to the founders of Russia itself. Which raises the question that drives the middle of this story. If the money was truly gone, why did half the world spend 50 years hunting for it? The answer begins on a bridge in Berlin, on a February night in 1920, when a young woman throws herself into the Landwehr Canal. A policeman pulls her out. She carries no papers, no purse, no name. For nearly 2 years in an asylum, she barely speaks. And then a rumor catches fire that this silent patient, with her scarred body and her hauntingly familiar face, is Anastasia, youngest daughter of the last tsar, somehow alive, somehow escaped from the basement where her family died. The woman came to be known as Anna Anderson, and she split the surviving family in two. A handful of relatives and old courtiers looked at her and wept in recognition. Most looked at her and saw a fraud. But what kept the fire burning for 6 decades was not sentiment. It was money, the rumored Romanov millions in foreign banks, which a surviving daughter, and only a surviving daughter, might legally claim. Her fight through the German courts is often described as the longest civil case in that country's history. Roughly 3 decades of hearings, handwriting experts, and dying witnesses. And it ended, incredibly, in a draw. Identity neither proven nor disproven. She died in Virginia in 1984, still insisting, to the end, that she was the daughter of the Tsar. Science got the final word. In 1994, DNA testing showed she was no Romanov at all. Her genes matched the family of Franziska Szankowska, a missing Polish factory worker. And in 2007, searchers near Yekaterinburg found the remains of the last 2 imperial children. Every member of the Tsar's household was accounted for. No one escaped that basement. The only survivors were the ones who had never been in it. So let us close the first question properly. The money trail. If there was no secret fortune waiting in the banks, what did the survivors actually live on? Charity, marriages, memoirs, wages, and, in one famous case, a box. Go back to Denmark, to a villa near Copenhagen, to the bed of an old woman. Maria Feodorovna spent her last years there on the kindness of her royal relatives, reportedly at times on an allowance from the same King George who had sent the battleship. Courtiers begged her to sell the jewels. She would not. As long as the box stayed shut, by her logic, the empire was merely interrupted. She died in October 1928. Within weeks, the box was on its way to England. What happened next is still argued about in royal history circles. The jewels were sold. Many of the finest pieces, by most accounts, passed into the collection of Queen Mary, the British Queen, and some are said to glitter in royal vaults to this day. Her daughters, Xenia and Olga, were supposed to receive the proceeds. Reportedly, the sums that reached them were a fraction of what the stones were worth, and some payments took years to arrive. Follow those 2 sisters to the end, because they are the answer to question 1. Xenia lived out her life in grace and favor houses lent by the British Crown, comfortable, dependent, dispossessed. Olga, the Tsar's youngest sister, farmed in Denmark, then fled again. This time from Stalin's shadow to rural Ontario, where the daughter of an emperor raised cattle and sold her own watercolors to pay the bills. Both sisters died in 1960, 7 months apart. Xenia in London, Olga in a small apartment above a beauty parlor in the East End of Toronto, taken in by Russian friends when she could no longer care for herself. Newspapers called her the last Grand Duchess. $300 billion had come down to this. A borrowed room, a kind family, and paintings sold for grocery money. The money never followed them. The fortune never left Russia. Which leaves the second question, who carries the name now? For that, go back to 1924 and to the cousin who crowned himself. Grand Duke Kirill had escaped early, slipping into Finland with his pregnant wife. Once the deaths of the Tsar and his brother seemed beyond doubt, Kirill followed the old succession laws to their conclusion and proclaimed himself Emperor of all the Russias from exile over an empire that no longer wanted one. Much of the family never forgave him. The Dowager Empress refused to accept it while any hope remained, but Kirill's line kept going. Claim intact, passed from father to son to granddaughter. Today that claim rests with Maria Vladimirovna, born in exile in 1953, living in Spain, styling herself head of the imperial house, recognized by some monarchists and emphatically not by others. Because there is a rival camp. The Romanov Family Association, descendants of the other surviving branches, rejects her claim outright. And its president in recent years has been a princess named Olga Andreevna Romanov, who lives not in a palace but in a country house in Kent. More than 100 descendants of the dynasty are scattered today across Europe and the Americas by most counts, farmers, bankers, authors. And a full century of exile has not settled which of them, if any, is the heir. And then, in this century, the story bent back toward Russia itself. In 2021, Maria's son George married in St. Petersburg, widely reported as the first Romanov wedding on Russian soil in more than a century. In October of 2022, his son Alexander was born in Moscow. A child of the claimant line, born in Russia for the first time since the revolution. No throne awaits him, but the name went home. So stand once more on the deck of the Marlborough in April of 1919, beside the old woman and her locked box. Behind her, 1/6 of the earth, the palaces, the gold, the mines, all of it staying exactly where it was. In her cabin, the only part of the greatest fortune in history small enough to be carried, and even that, in the end, slipped through her daughter's fingers. That is the quiet lesson of the Romanov survivors. A fortune built on a crown is never really owned. It is borrowed from the belief of others, and the moment the belief dies, the richest family on earth possesses exactly what it can carry. The Romanovs carried out a box, a name, and their lives. Only the name still holds its value, which leaves you with the argument I want in the comments. Those jewels, bought from a powerless widow's estate, now resting by most accounts in other royal collections. Was that a fair sale between relatives or a quiet act of plunder from a family too broken to bargain? Tell me which side you land on. And if stories like this one belong in your evenings, you already know where to find us.